Excellent. Welcome, everybody, and sorry to keep you waiting, Darren. I have 5 minutes turned into 10, so my apologies for that. Yeah. So we'll move on to that now. Insurance. Where's it on my view?
It's part of
your financial report. Yeah. So I'd like to start by asking you if you could just open the conversation. That'd be
bit of background and introduction.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren, for making the time to join us this morning. I can just provide a bit of background to councillors. We currently have 2 insurers. We have Marsh for our above ground assets, and we have the Local Authority Protection Program, referred to as LAP, for underground assets. So there are 2 different insurance components, and they have 2 different periods, which is slightly frustrating. So Darren represents Marsh, which is probably the largest portion of our insurance. And just to give some context, is that the current policy for council is to fully insure, and which we have continued to do, but that is probably ideally an LTP review discussion time to look at that. We indicated earlier this year through the annual plan process that insurance premiums were going to increase, and at the same time, to compound the increases, we've had our asset base increase significantly. So our asset base around the material damage policy was 50 previously, it's now 86 million. So big increases in valuations, and the trend isn't changing. It looks like our assets are going to continue to increase in value. So those are the components that have driven us to this increase. 2 things to point out: that the current figures that are quoted are not final. We don't have the LAP numbers in yet for the beginning of the insurance year, which is the 1st of November, and the current Marsh figures have got to be verified against invoices. I believe there's a bit of movement there. So these are estimates, and very close estimates, but they're not final, and they will be final at the next committee meeting. So Darren, I invite you to discuss obviously what we've briefly touched on and how we got to where we are today. And we're seeing these very significant increases in insurance premiums for a lot of councils and for the combined district as well. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, Karen. And also thank you for the invite to join you today. Look, Karen's heard me use this particular terminology before, and Charlie as well, who I think is in the room. But let's simply put it as it is. 2023 has been the perfect storm when it comes to simply property insurance renewal. For all of our clients, I would simply suggest you have had inflationary-driven uplifts in value, and you've then had insurers reviewing not only their claims portfolio for individual clients, but their actual losses from a variety of events. And that isn't just limited to New Zealand, it's global. 2022, just for commentary, was the worst year on record in terms of losses through natural disaster in the world. So it's fair to say my reference to perfect storm perhaps is a bad pun, but nevertheless an accurate one in terms of the challenges the insurance property market sector has experienced, acknowledging, as Karen so rightfully put it, you had the combination of uplift in values combined with insurers. And there aren't a lot of insurers who are actually available to the council network, with particular reference to councils located in Wairarapa, Wellington, and the lower or bottom of the North Island. Ultimately, it is a case of insurance is going to get increasingly hard to obtain and more expensive if it can be obtained. The scenario that is in front of us is not an unexpected scenario. I think it's probably one of those scenarios that we now find in 2023 that's been in many ways signalled since well before 2021, 2020 with the COVID pandemic. And now those signals have really seen the rubber hit the road. So it is fair to say that while we are effectively by date past renewal, it's how you plan in terms of your longer term future for a reliance which is less on insurance and using insurance as a partial means of funding losses. Otherwise, there are two things that will be material. It will be incredibly expensive. And when we talk about this, if I crystal ball gaze, looking ahead to perhaps 2027, 2028, which perhaps based on signals will be on the other side of what I will still call three waters, you will find this year would be a very good year in terms of the changes that you've unfortunately had to endure as a entity that buys insurance as its main means of funding losses, particularly around property. The most challenging period that I can offer since before the Christchurch earthquake sequence commenced in 2010.
Thanks a lot.
Councillor, obviously.
Yeah, kia ora, Darren. Thanks for that. I guess I've got a number of questions. So in no particular order. I think my questions are sort of around the ability to bulk buy our insurance with Carterton and Marsden, removing assets from the schedule of assets. I like sort of self-funding our insurance here, and that could be things like public toilets. I don't know if we insure those or not.
We do.
We do. I mean, no one ever made money by buying insurance, right? Apart from insurance companies. I guess how many claims have we sort of had that have been in excess of the premiums paid? I guess as strategic purchasing of our insurance around, I guess, buying insurance kind of as and when we need it, i.e. applying for loans, etc. And sort of how does self-insurance kind of already work? And is that an option for someone like a council?
Yeah,
So
good.
a lot of questions, but in no particular order.
Yeah. Look, I think in terms of if I talk about claims to start with, then of course it's fair to say our discussion probably today will centre as it started on property, because that's your biggest spend and the one that's likely to be the most volatile going forward. Firstly, in terms of claims, a little bit of an ironic answer. I am currently discussing a flood-related occurrence which could lead to a claim for South Wairarapa District Council. So that's point one. I mentioned that it's not in the period 1 July 2022 to 1 July 2023 from the information I have available. So to focus on that period, no claims for South Wairarapa District Council in respect to property. The loss situation for South Wairarapa District Council over an extended period doesn't actually emphasise any significant loss in the recent past. So effectively no claims would be how I'd simply define it. What we have done, and I think it's important I reference this when we've considered loss and claims. So going back over the last 3, maybe 4 insurance periods, we've consistently looked at what would it mean if a deductible was raised. I think I heard Karen mention this earlier. Currently, there is a conservative deductible of $5,000 applied for the majority of claims which aren't considered natural disaster. The influence on premium by adjusting the deductible, even as recent when we looked at this ahead of 1 July 2023, if it went as high as $50,000 or $100,000, was so insignificant. It wasn't economical when you looked at how you would fund the deductibles or uninsured contribution. It wasn't economical or appropriate, I would recommend, to suggest to change the deductible. Simply reason, the cost of insurance for the councils in the Wairarapa region is largely built around natural disaster. So effectively you pay a lot for what I will call your earthquake cover. So in terms of self-insurance and funding, that's a real significant topic for a lot of councils at the moment. I'll extend that, a lot of clients. So a lot of the work that Marsh is doing is actually more around what has been called alternative risk funding. There are words that you may have heard: captives, parametrics, and in some cases, to use more, if I may, simple terms that one of my council contactors used, simply putting aside a pool of money to fund losses outside of any of these fancy jargonous terms that I've just referenced. So it is really a case and it's a rhetorical question for South Wairarapa District Council. Do you want more of the same or worse? Or are you in a position where you can start, as I touched on earlier, building a strategy with Marsha's guidance and the science available to you to actually determine the right balance between buying insurance, particularly for property, and funding losses independently? It's a little bit coincidental, and Charlie will support me, I think, in this discussion point. I've often referenced, why do you insure toilet blocks? It's a common reference that I have raised over the years, that while they are important to the community, when you weigh up the reason you insure as a council, you generally, I think it's fair to say, look at the worst case scenario, which is a massive earthquake hitting the region, and a large number of your assets that are insured, and perhaps some that aren't, actually being damaged either beyond sustainable repair or lost, put it that way, in terms of needing to reinvigorate your community with structuring of those assets again. And it's often down to, when we focus on toilet blocks, would they be that important to your community if you lost water infrastructure and other key pieces of your asset portfolio in that earthquake event that I'm referring to? And just to expand a bit further, when we consider bulk buying and the like, yes, there is a bulk buying scenario going on for councils, although, as I've said to Karen in terms of an email exchange yesterday, if we did separate South Wairarapa District Council from Carterton and Masterton, I don't see in the foreseeable future that would have any influence on premium. But the current format where we come together with the two other council representatives is in many ways, you build a consistent approach in terms of how you would manage this event that I speak of, a massive earthquake hitting the Wairarapa region. And I like to think you build a strategy that is not only specific to your rate-paying community in South Wai, but for the wider region, because you would work together, I'm certain, if an event of that magnitude that I'm referring to did occur, which would be an absolute necessity, in the same way civil defence and other organisations not directly connected to us will do their part. So it is about the future, I think, and what you would change, as I say, with our guidance in terms of your next renewal and beyond, going through 2026, 2028 and 2030. That is definitely quite key right now.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Are you had all your questions answered?
Yeah,
Very much so, yeah.
I think doing the big one for me, I think is removing assets from the scheduled assets.
Yeah. I think a lot of this will relate to a conversation during long-term plan as well, and we'll be able to draw down on some of the detail. And I'd expect that Marsh would be available, or somebody would be available to give us some guidance on some of the less risk areas that we could actually cut some costs on.
Colin, if I could just add to that, we have previously identified back to council that we are insuring some low risk buildings, and the decision was always to fully insure, which is at the time, but I think it's time now to review toilet blocks.
Excellent.
Buildings close to demolition, that sort of stuff.
Totally agree. What did you get? Oh, sorry.
I was just going to offer a couple of other comments, because I think just to provide some in-depth scenarios that we go through that isn't often recognised, and I think it's important we look at these just in terms of the format for that long-term plan, or maybe medium-term plan, if you don't mind a couple of minutes of commentary from me. So often we look at moving away from a council insuring for replacement value. So in other words, if it costs to replace a building, let's insure for that value. We've discussed with insurers the motive and the potential to insure for indemnity value, which most of you, I think, will have heard that term before, but let's call it a depreciation amount off replacement value. We've analysed that, adding a demolition element. Ultimately, the saving, similar to my comments about excess, not there. We've looked at self-insurance retention layers, which are effectively as simple as, well, insurers, you provide us 50% cover, we'll top that up. Insurers are not confident of that being a successful scenario, but they are more enthusiastic about council taking the first line of risk. So in other words, this a higher or larger deductible. We've also phrased to them, why don't a council, what about just looking at natural disaster cover only? So in other words, you remove your loss protection for events such as storms or fires or floods, if you will. Insurers have, in some cases, been hesitant toward that as well. It's perhaps a scenario which is more material for councils outside of the Wairarapa or Wellington region, because the bulk of your premium, as I said earlier, is tailored to earthquake anyway. So you're not saving yourself enough premium to recommend, from this perspective, adopting that format. And the other scenarios, again, I was talking about insurers earlier. We have insurers consistently coming off risk in this region. In other words, we write the cover now, we won't do it anymore. We have insurers imposing additional terms, and you currently have 4 insurers plus a 5th insurer coming into your program this year. So in other words, we had to reach out offshore to a facility in London to actually find the additional capacity to actually maintain what you've got. And it's, who do you go to get these particular improvements that you might seek outside of actually looking within? So that the whole insurance environment that we currently operate in has never been more challenged. And ultimately what it looks like beyond the next couple of years, I would be guessing. It's as bad as it ever has been to be an insurance buyer as far as timing. Just even if we bring Christchurch into the mix, 2010, 2011, I think is the noted period, we could at least go offshore to Lloyd's to fill gaps. The Lloyd's market and those offshore markets that used to be relied on for hard to place risk, they're not there anymore. Talking about, as I did earlier, the hardest, worst, strongest, most expensive natural catastrophe period, 2022, the world has actually ever seen. Far above Katrina in terms of inflationary adjusted. And those events, if I showed you material, which I've actually shared with Karen, it would paint quite a tragic picture. And there are multiple reasons for it, not just climate change.
Thanks, Darren, for that summary. No doubt we'll seek some guidance and advice as we work through long-term planning in terms of where we go with insurance. And I think, unfortunately, we're caught between a rock and a hard place right now.
So protect infrastructure or protect ratepayers, right?
Sorry?
Protect infrastructure or protect ratepayers.
Yeah.
Rates increases.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. So that's
not easy.
No, it's not easy. Yeah, but it's we'll have that conversation. I have no doubt about it. Woody, did you have anything else to add?
Oh, not really.
Not really?
It's pretty much
yeah.
Everything's pretty much been answered. Just the vehicle ones. It's quite surprised how high the vehicle insurances have gone up. Having my own vehicle insurance, no, it's gone up quite a bit. It's nowhere near as that. Is that because we've got more? Have we got more vehicles now, or is it
New fleet, partly.
we've got some fleet renewals, so the increase values a bit higher. Yeah.
Do we depreciate the value of those vehicles and insure them to the depreciated value?
To the replacement value.
Yeah, no, not the depreciated value. So maybe that's
something to look at.
That's all part of the policy review.
Well, we need to just.
I think we have that conversation. Yeah.
Motor vehicles, which is part of the
Great big
plan.
conversation, right?
Yeah.
Tim, would you like a comment from me in respect to motor?
Yeah.
So very much a industry change there as well. In fairness, the Wairarapa region received one of the lower rate increases. Your loss ratio, so that's claims versus premium, is still quite attractive to insurers. We did go through a remarketing exercise where we tried to invite as many as appropriate carriers into the equation to actually provide alternatives to your current supply. That's IAG. All of them either were interested but ultimately didn't quote because their what we call books are challenged because of claim pressures. The one or several that did quote, there was much of a muchness between them, and we therefore centered our discussions more around claim response. So IAG, that's in a simple term, NZI, Lumley State, AMI in the current environment, was seen as the best carrier because their particular changes were not significant and they remain the right insurer in terms of timely, efficient response. So it's not just a premium scenario. Many of the councils that I represent have had losses which have exceeded the premium that the insurers have collected, so plus 100% loss ratios. I can assure you that their rate increases were much more significant than what you have experienced in South Y. I think the biggest scenario, and it's not the same as property by any means, if you keep a clean loss period, we're always going to have claims, but a loss ratio that for every $10 paid, less than $4 to $5 is claimed back, insurers will see you as a risk they want to keep writing. $7, $8 out of every 10 claimed back. That is very much a different matter. And like any industry, repairers, panel beaters, mechanical repairers, inflationary pressures, cost of parts, cost of getting materials into the country or transited to the region where repairs are happening, is pushing the prices up. And that's consistent, I should say, between one insurer and the next. So you have different pressures. They are not so much weather driven, although I'm sure in this sequence, weather is influencing losses, claims, therefore. It is purely a case of the industries that are dealing with assets or the markets that are dealing with assets are under supreme claim pressure, property first, but unfortunately motor not completely removed. So it's more about the claim drivers and still being individuals within your environment in terms of pricing. I think the biggest aspect, and you did touch on it, team, is that when you do put values for us, they are GST exclusive. And because market value, which translates to mean what does your dealer, local dealer, perhaps in the Wairarapa, sell these vehicles for, if that's an option, that's the numbers we should be presenting to insurers. But overall, with the size of the fleet that you have, whether you declare it precise or just slightly different, it's ultimately not going to have a major influence on premium. Your fleet is still not going to challenge them too much.
Thank you. Thanks, Darren. Right. Worship, did you have a question?
Yes, I did have a couple of questions, please. Thanks, Chair. Darren, the first question would be, so if we did want to make a, shall we say, a noticeable change to what we're doing, because I do feel that after what's happened just recently, a 56% increase in insurance is very difficult to bear. Is there one or two things that you would suggest that would actually make a, at least would get people to recognise that we did do the best we could to moderate that sized increase?
Yeah, I think, Mayor Connolly, it firstly comes down to selecting how you would choose to risk mitigate. So there's a step back. The step back is you are using insurance as your main financier, if I can simply put it that way, if a loss occurs. So if you are to look at that, what are the controls you have to rely on an insurance solution for property, of course, less than you do now? Do you have a fund available to you, which is independent and available to pay for costs? You perhaps do for things like roading and the like, where they're not waka kotahi related roading and other infrastructure. We've already seen in terms of my comments today and presented ahead of renewal, changing the deductibles isn't going to achieve anything of significance. So we might as well rule that out. So it does firstly come down to, well, if we're not going to rely on insurance as we do now, what are our options outside of that? Now, that's where we can offer you really useful commentary. We have a team set up around advice and alternative risk financing where we would expose you to, if I may. It may prove one thing, the current method is right. Yet it simply has to be considered, like we've talked about the public toilets, what other assets could you as a community do without? So if you did have this event, would your community accept the change? Would there be, we don't need those assets. Would any particular considerations, local government act to the fore, be needed to go through first? The consultation with your community? Would Treasury or any other entity you need to report to, would they accept your strategy, which is we don't want to pay this premium? We don't want to have to endure that sort of level of increase. Bearing in mind, it's fair to say the main reason is not a premium rate increase, but the value of your assets going from 50 approximately million to just over 86 mil. So that's 72%. So it's 72% driven by what your valuation team, your contracted valuation team is telling South Y, that's what you should insure for if you insure these assets. So it starts what you're insuring for, and then using that data, Marsh presents, negotiates, works with carriers to come up with an insurance solution based on the strategy discussed generally at the start of a calendar year. So it's about many things first. So it's not one or two things. It's about giving you what I will call the confidence that any decisions you're going to make can be managed to the acceptance of your community. Because if there's one thing that the events of this year have shown us, Hawke's Bay naturally to the fore, if people have to wait, don't hear anything, they get quite upset. And if there's one thing I can offer with the work I did, particularly around the Christchurch earthquakes events, is that people had to wait a very long time. And we're talking not months or weeks, we're talking years. So how would the community feel about that if there wasn't an insurance reliance, there was another means? And they may like that other means if you could understand how quickly it would play out in terms of resolution. And then how do you fund any debt? How do you fund other factors that perhaps currently are covered by the QBEs and the like of this world as the insurers?
Darren, can I just cut you short a little bit? We're running really tight time-wise. In fact, we're getting pretty close. So, Mayor Martin, did you have another quick question? And Darren, if you could just condense your answer down a little. I think the broader conversation we can have at a later date. But just if you could probably respond to Mayor Martin's question, that'd be great. Thanks.
Oh, just one question. If we did exclude public toilets from the list of assets to be insured, would it make a material difference?
No.
Right. Thank you.
That was a great you did condense that down. Thank you very much, Darren.
And can I just clarify? Thank you, Darren. You do represent combined councils, so it's Carterton and Masterton. When we go to market, we work with the three councils, so we don't do it in isolation. And the other two councils have experienced the same increases that we have. So we are not alone in this
Great.
issue. And we work very closely with Darren and the other councils, and they're extremely good at keeping us informed about what's happening and attending workshops and meetings from a combined council perspective. So they work very hard for us at the moment.
Fantastic. Thanks, Karen. Any other comments before we close this session? Nothing. Thanks very much for your time, Darren. Thanks, Darren. I really appreciate it, mate.
Be in touch.
Thank you. All right. See you later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. So we'll just move on to the formal part of your information report. Do I have somebody to receive the report? Somebody move. Woody, thank you. Second, thank you. All in favour? Yep. All in favour, your worship. Yep. Receive an update on the interim audit, final audit. But did we covered off audit here, have we? The audit report, we did.
Yeah, I could briefly, do you want me to just try and skim through the rest of this?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm trying to be short. I know that we're pressure time wise, but I just the audit report, because you are presenting the audit report to
risk and assurance.
Risk and assurance this afternoon
Yep.
as well. Yeah. So perhaps if you could just highlight a couple of areas.
Okay.
Really good.
So in terms of the year end 30th of June, we were issued an unmodified audit opinion, which is great. Basically, there's no major issues. They give us recommendations and categorise the recommendations on priority. We had nothing urgent, but we had some that were necessary. They're included in the report, in this report. And one of them, which is a common, frequent annual message, is keeping the annual leave balances at a certain level.
Yeah.
So they look at that every year. So there were three priority necessary points that they made, and we've addressed all three. So there's nothing further on the 30th of June, 2022. And the annual report was published 2 weeks ago. Now, for 23, for the year ending 23, the interim audit commenced on the 26th of June, just for 1 week, but the final audit is on the 25th of September to the 13th of October. That provides a risk of getting adoption and clearance of the financial statements in order to adopt on the 31st of October. As we get closer to that time, I will advise you as to how likely that risk is. And that's what we're taking to the Assurance Committee this afternoon. It is a risk that we won't comply again. Now, the Audit New Zealand have since issued their engagement letter and their audit fee proposal letter, which we've just briefly talked about, and we will be meeting with them next week with the Mayor. So we know that all councils have received increased audit fees across the whole country, and some are much higher than ours. So we continue to work with Audit New Zealand to improve the relationship and process and communications across the council and other councils. Indog?
Perfect. Any questions? Yeah.
Okay, so fair value assessment of our infrastructure assets. Now, this touches on insurance. We revalue our assets every 3 years formally, and then in the years in between, we have to do a fair value assessment, and that's an audit requirement. Now, last year we did a fair value assessment and we saw our property assets increase in value significantly. It's partly the insurance increases, and we were very late in getting that information, and it held up the audit and it held up everything really. Now we've done it early, and they've come back and said, yes, your assets have increased in value even again. So that will drive potential insurance, and we are waiting on Audit New Zealand to confirm and to determine if it's a material change to the value of the assets and needs to be recorded in the financial statements. So last year we worked with Audit New Zealand to understand the level of materiality before you revalue your financial statements. We don't have the answer to this year's revaluation, but again, they've gone up 9%. So it's likely we will have to revalue formally the assets and push it through the accounts.
So it's a quick question there. What we revalue for replacement, and that was the policy, obviously, of council to have full insurance on things. Is there an opportunity to look at that revaluation for replacement to perhaps depreciated value of the asset?
That's an insurance component we can look at.
Yeah.
In terms of financially, we have to revalue them at the correct value. But for insurance purposes, you could choose to do it.
So can you not do that for audit as well at the depreciated value?
No, you must record the revalued asset value.
Okay.
And it increases your equity and increases your profitability.
But it also increases their costs.
Yeah. And also it's not realisable. It's
not really.
So it's a
Councillor Pipe.
It's
a pipe.
It's a pipe.
Under there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, and we don't insure for roads, so,
No.
and it's complex.
Anyhow, good discussion for LTP. Thanks.
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm pleased that we actually got that piece of work completed early.
Fabulous work.
The value is fantastic. Now, just a minor technical issue around financial reporting. And my paper explains it, that we are moving from Tier 2 PBE accounting standards in terms of reporting to Tier 1. So that means when you start, your revenue is over 30 million, you move to a new financial reporting standard under the accounting standards. That requires the financial statements to be repositioned, and it's a technical compliance matter that we require expert advice on how we do that. But there'll be certain things in the financial statements we will have to do differently, and we will be audited on it as well.
Is there an additional cost associated?
There is. My paper, we've contacted PwC and asked them to quote to do the work, and that is up to $10,000. And we do not have the technical expertise to complete that work, and Carterton equally use PwC for the same type of work. So it was really informing you that our financial statements and our reporting standards have to be.
So is there no one locally you can use rather than big national companies?
And that's the other councils use PwC for that as well. It's you have to use one of the big six to make sure that you absolutely comply, and you need their expert advice to do that. And you'd have to probably reference your work back to them anyway. And it has to be audited, so you'd have to get an opinion from a registered accountant practice that is correct. Fortunately, it's not huge, but it is a consideration. The water services reform program, I go into quite a bit of detail in the report for background information and other considerations. As we've discussed, as a working group at the moment with the NTU, which is the National Transition Unit, and that work is starting to intensify and increase. And there's a lot of considerations and a lot of work to be done, which we've talked about. Of course, a lot of it hangs on the election in October. So we have to proceed as if it's all carrying on. But we just got the news this morning that the NTU have given us, pledged to give us some additional funding to do some of this work. Last year we received 350. They've increased that to 450. But they'll only give us 6 months of it now.
The 12 after.
So
So it's another 450 or from 350?
no, another 450, but they'll only give us half. So my question is, well, when's the other half coming?
Yeah, precisely.
So it's at least they recognise, and it's all three councils in the district that have gone up from 350 to 450. So we will be having a meeting shortly to discuss how we use those funds. And not forgetting, I'm part of the regional CFO group where we discuss the workload and the efforts that are required for the NTU. Other councils employ consultants to help them with some of this, and we don't. And I rely heavily on some of my colleagues and the other councils to do the work, to tell me what I need.
That's great. That's a good cooperative arrangement.
Well, why not?
Yeah,
CS is a little council with not much in so many ways. So we use their expertise, and they've got some really big teams in some of those councils. So, so the NTU is ramping up, and the live date is still the 1st of October.
Right.
What else have I got?
Wait with bated breath to see. So that's being rushed through the House at the moment, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
It could just as easily be revoked if the national.
Well, it's going to take a while for that to happen.
100 days.
Yeah, first 100 days, that's what they say.
Very interesting. My other point, I've just, the rating review, the full rating review that continues, and there is a workshop on the 17th scheduled, where we will continue our work with Philip Jones. That work is obviously a key part to the LTP and setting the rates. Now, just on that, I might have missed it in my rush to get through.
Sorry, okay.
That's all right.
I'm going to make a recommendation at the end of this meeting. But I think
Okay. QV have issued their revaluation schedule. Now, that is a key component to the LTP. If we don't have the revaluations, then we can't do the LTP. Now, that is on the risk register. Met with QV yesterday. They have agreed to come to council to do a presentation on their work, and they have agreed to come back to council and present their findings. And that will be a strategic view of the district and what's happened, what changes have taken place over the last 3 years. They did the last revaluation 3 years ago. There has been some criticism over their process and their delays because their work has to be audited, and there is a risk around getting their work audited as well. So we've had a meeting today to say, hey, just keep us informed and please come to council and present your work. So that is really key to the LTP and rating.
excellent.
Yep. What else?
I'm sorry, Karen.
That's all right.
We are working our way through it. So
Lagoimas, just a
Yep.
comment.
Yep.
We have seen Lagoimas increase by 400%. We have recidivist Lagoimas.
yeah, well, that worries me actually. Yeah, I know. I'm just not sure how you rein that in, but it does need to have a conversation about what we do.
What
I
we are
think part of it is I live in humbling, can't live right as I was.
We are trying to, in some cases where the same person is lagoiming us every week deliberately, and we have got some who are deliberate.
Yeah.
We are saying now the information is available on the website, or it's in the annual plan or the annual report, or it is simply not available. Because some of the requests for information are too detailed and they're too operational. Some of them are challenging statements made outside of council, and I can't answer the lagoimas because I didn't make the statement. So some of the lagoimas are bordering on unreasonable, and some of them are continuing to come back on the same lagoima. So just a point, it is becoming a bit of a risk, I think, that we are being taken away from our day jobs to consistently answer lagoimas.
So you're going to raise that risk and assurance.
Insurance risk, yeah, all of my stuff's in there for risk.
What's the legality?
Amanda is working with the Ombudsman to talk about at what point do they become
Yeah, vexatious.
vexatious. They are vexatious, but we have to prove it.
And it's not based on the individual, it's based on the thing that's being requested. So it's making it about focusing on the question and making that information available publicly over time allows us to point people towards that information. But part of the issue is the rule around being vexatious, when it's all coming from one person, you know, they could potentially generate an entire day's worth of work or distract someone for an entire day to actually answer their questions. And we're bound to answer. I mean, we've got extension periods of up to for a further 10 days after the initial 20 days. But ultimately, yeah, it's a really time-consuming exercise. And it pulls everybody. It's not just a finance one. It pulls every single part of the organisation to have to. And Amy's got that
And
unenviable discussion. Conversation.
Review.
So I think some methodology or some way of looking at it.
Yeah, we are looking at
assurance of risk.
Yeah. And pushing back a little bit on
Yep.
some of the, we have been told that we are going to be continued to be lagoimed.
Oh, I'm sure.
They have made it quite obvious that they're not ceasing.
Right.
And then I just have included again the financial delegations policy, which
Yep.
is in the process of being reviewed.
Yep.
But just to remind everyone that there are certain levels of expenditure, and unbudgeted expenditure must come before council.
Yep.
On that particular point, obviously, elected members don't have delegated financial authority, so every bit of expense that comes through must have a budget line and pre-approval beforehand. We can't commit to budgets that don't exist within a particular budget line within a business group.
I'm sure councillors are well aware of that. So one would hope it's captured by all. Thank you.
And essentially an elected member, if they require to spend money, they have to go to the budget manager who manages that budget.
Yeah.
Through the CE.
Through the
CE.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you can't spend council funds.
No, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
I'd like to reiterate that point. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Reinforce that it's minuted. Okay. Thank you very much for
Sorry, it
your
was a bit
comprehensive
rushed.
report, and thank you for the insurance presentation as well. I'm sure that it's a lot of information to digest, and that it stimulates some great conversations in the upcoming LTP conversations. So I'd like to move that we receive the financial report 1 to 10 on the information. Do I have a seconder for that?
Yes.
Thank you, Your Worship. All in favour?
Aye.
Thank you. Okay, we've got one very quick item, which is in public excluded. It's all right.
At the recording.
So I'll move that we move, hang on, where's my agenda? Sorry. Oh,
Anyway, you're on page.
where am I? Sorry,
There you go.
I got lost here. So I'll move that we move into public excluded. Do I have a seconder? Thank you. Councillor Mosley.
Okay.
All in favour?